Well, hello, and welcome to the History Hour podcast. This is Evan, Chris, Bethany, and Caleb, your hosts.
Hello.
We're all members of the University of Maine Upper Escala History Club. This is the show for all the curious and those attracted with history and fascinating stories. And on this first episode of our podcast series, we will be discussing the event of the Day of Pigs during the Cold War of the mid-1940s. With us today, we also have a special guest, Dr. John Zaborny, history professor here at the University of Maine Upper Escala, where he will be joining us today to offer us some insights and details about the event, and with his expertise, guide us to correct conclusions and history telling. Welcome, Dr. Zaborny.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So, guys, what is the Cold War, and why did we decide to talk about the Bay of Pigs today?
Well, first of all, it's the anniversary of the Bay of Pigs. Today marks the I can't count.
It's when the event took place.
Yeah. Happened many decades ago. And,
I mean,
1961.
yes.
1961, yeah.
What he said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it is a big event, and again, it took part in it started in the mid-40s, 1940s, and then the actual event took part in the 60s, if I'm correct, Dr. Zaborny, right?
What began in the 40s?
Yes, the beginning of the Cold War. And then you have a few years after that, in the mid-60s, that you have the actual event of the Day of Pigs.
Right.
So, let's talk about the Cold War, actually. Let's start with that. So, we know, of course, and most of Americans know, because it was a big thing for Americans, and Russians at this point, Soviets, it was that after the Second World War, we had that competition between the two biggest nations at that moment, that was America and Russia, and it wasn't an official war, of course, it was more of
the angriest staring match of all time.
Exactly.
Posturing and like it's like if dogs on either side of a gate are barking at each other, and then the gate slowly opens, and then they run away from each other.
I mean, I call it games. It's
Pretty much, it was a struggle. It was an economic, political struggle, diplomatic struggle, a struggle in all senses except military, and that's in fact the basis of the term Cold War. Hot War refers to shooting, and that's why they call it Cold War. It was a struggle in all respects except for no military action between the two, although it came close a couple of times. Later on, we discovered closer than we realized at the time.
it did.
Luckily it did, or else we probably wouldn't be
Yeah,
here.
probably not.
Probably wouldn't be
Absolutely.
here recording this podcast or anything.
And I mean, the Cold War changed. I mean, how America operated since then, and how Americans of that generation thought. I mean, how they grew up, that they have to go under the desks during school.
Most optimistic effort ever. If you go under the desk, you won't die.
Civil defense drills, that's the way
Defense
to survive.
drills, yeah.
That was what people were told, that's how you survive an atomic attack.
And even the government, like Operation Mongoose, one of Operation Mongoose, where we decided, let's assassinate this leader of a country. It was the biggest, oh wow, we're doing this, alright.
Well, the Bay of Pigs kind of led up to that, because since Bay of Pigs was such a big failure for America and Kennedy's administration, they were kind of like, oh, we need to do anything possible to get back America's support. So then Operation Mongoose happened, and yeah.
I mean, of course it was. I mean, you have a whole generation, as I said, growing up with these events, and that changed, of course, the course of the history after that. And yeah, with the Bay of Pigs, and we go into politics now and economic situations, and Dr. Zaborny can testify on that it was an event that we as a nation were trying to regain something that we lost in a sense.
Right. The whole idea was American foreign policy wanted Castro out. And the whole thing with the Bay of Pigs invasion, the part of what was going on there was that you want to get him out, but not have any obvious make it obvious that the United States was behind this attempt to get him out. Of course, they figured that out anyway. But the idea was, well, let's use some Cuban exiles. There's 14 or 1,500 of them. They're trained. This starts actually under Eisenhower, prior to JFK, this whole plan. And so JFK essentially inherits this plan, and he goes ahead with it to send these, and the CIA trains these people, send them in to Cuba to invade Cuba. And the whole idea is that once these people show up, that people in Cuba, there's going to be this huge uprising, that they're going to just welcome these people, and oh, this is wonderful, yes, we can get rid of Castro now that you people are here. It doesn't work out that way, because, well, the people love Castro. At least the people who were still there, the ones who hated him, got out. Those are the exiles, went to Miami, you know. So it does not work out that way, and you know, the Cuban military far outnumbered these people who showed up. They weren't trained as well. There was no assistance from the U.S. military once things kind of got bogged down on the beach, even though people thought that, well, if we get into trouble, the Air Force will show up, but that didn't happen because, well, we can't have any U.S. involvement, and because we don't want World War III, this kind of thing. And so what happens is a bunch of these people were killed, others were captured, and the ones who were captured actually were ransomed to get back the following year. Millions and millions of dollars to get them back to Florida the following year. Because they were tried.
Million, yeah.
What's that?
$53 million.
Yeah. A lot of money, and they were tried. I mean, initially they were tried and sentenced to decades of prison time. You know, but we'll release them if you give us this money. And so the following year, 62, they end up, they come back.
And we should point out, to kind of backtrack what you just said, like, why did people like Castro at that moment? It was because the previous general that was in place before Castro was General Fulgencio Batista.
Right, Fulgencio Batista, yeah.
Fulgencio Batista, yeah, and he was a pro-American president, of course, and I think at his administration, 50% of all the agriculture, and I think it was, they had sugar canes, that was all sold to American companies and American
companies and interests owned a lot of the sugar cane, a lot of the utilities, and things like this in Cuba. In other words, the place, a lot of the land in Cuba, the infrastructure and so on, was owned by Americans and American companies. And this started in the 1890s, and they continued after that, because, and this is a typical pattern during the Cold War. You know, we United States policymakers, you know, there's certain people in certain countries, well, you know, we like them because they allow American companies to go in there and operate in any way they choose. And this was what was happening under Batista. He was allowing American companies to do what they wanted.
Well, that's also what happened in Vietnam, right? Like,
right.
It's almost the same as that situation. America was like, they're communists, so the people are obviously not happy there because they're communists. So we're gonna go in there, try to set people free, and try to embrace them to the American way, and
right.
They didn't really like that.
Right, and of course that's the line. I mean, you know, something similar happened in Guatemala in '54. What was happening in Guatemala, what was really happening in Guatemala, was United Fruit Company, which is based in, I want to say Boston. I'm trying to remember. You know, its interests were threatened because land was nationalized there, taken away. The new incoming president down there decided that he was going to nationalize this land, give it to the Guatemalan people, and this sort of thing. The United Fruit Company's land. The United Fruit Company didn't like that. The United Fruit Company had connections to the government, to policymakers in the government, and the State Department, and all of this. And they said, well, you know, we need to do something about that, this guy down there in Guatemala. And so this is why the CIA engineers this overthrow of this guy who took away United Fruit Company's land. And made it look like the whole thing was staged. It was made to look like this revolt of Guatemalans against communism, you know, this sort of thing. And because during the Cold War, of course, the whole communism thing was the line, you know. In other words, these people down there are resisting communism and they scored a victory and so on and so forth. No, that was not the case. It was because United Fruit Company's interests were threatened and they didn't like that.
And I mean, communism was another excuse for them to do what they did. I mean, because of the previous administration that was not communist at all, then you have this new leader, Fidel Castro, that he was openly communist and he brought his ideas there.
And of course, he nationalized Americans' property down there too.
Oh yeah,
you know, and that's what was not liked, you know. And we cut off diplomatic relations with them, stop importing sugar, and that was the huge export of sugar. Most of Cuba's sugar had gone to the United States, you know. And so the United States puts an embargo on Cuban sugar imports, cuts off diplomatic relations, and then the Soviet Union establishes diplomatic relations with Cuba. And next thing you know, you have the Bay of Pigs invasion because Kennedy decides, again, going back to the whole thing about Kennedy being, he was only in his 40s, born in the 20th century, unlike Eisenhower before him, very young, and so on, and of course, in terms of domestic politics, as well as the perceptions of the Soviets and China, Kennedy has to be tough. There's this whole thing you have to be tough on communism as far as abroad and in terms of U.S. politics. Just like in the 19th century, you know, you have to be strong on slavery if you're a politician. Same general idea. And so Kennedy, you know, felt that he had to make a score against communism in the world in order to not be accused of being, as they would say, soft on communism. Okay, but where do you do that? You know, you don't. It's not safe to do that by, you know, dropping bombs on Moscow. No, you do it somewhere else. You do it in Cuba. And also ultimately you do it in Vietnam too, because it's safer there, but you can still play this tough role. And so he felt like he had to, even though in his own mind and also in the minds of some of the people around him, they said, this isn't a good idea, sending these exiles down there, because he inherited the plan from Eisenhower. This isn't a good idea. And he kind of knew himself that he wasn't, but he felt this pressure.
You need to be hard on communism.
Right, exactly. He said, "Oh well, I have to do it," because he felt if he didn't do it, then people would accuse him of being soft.
Turn him down,
Yeah.
As what other countries of the USSR would have immediately claimed, you were soft, we can do anything we want because you won't do anything.
Yeah, true.
And this was the mindset too of the of Kennedy and that whole generation is that what will they think if we don't do anything? I mean, this is the generation that grew up for World War II, Hitler, and their whole thinking was, and there's direct connections here, their whole thinking was that, well, the British and the French and so on didn't stand up and stop Hitler, and look what happened. And so therefore, now, we have to be strong on communism, otherwise
we need to act. Yeah,
right. We're going to get into another war, and they took that. That's what they saw. They're comparing Hitler to this post-war environment, which of course is not a real good comparison, but that's what they did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you know, they will think that we are afraid and so on if we don't do something. And then they will only become more aggressive, because that's what Hitler did, right? Yeah.
So Bethany, to put you on the spot, so I know you did some research on that. So you want to give us a small overview before we continue on of the war, or
of the war? No.
The Bay of Pigs. So, and that's a good point of the discussion. So we're going to move on and talk about what actually happened on that day, since we did give a brief overview of the Cold War. So let's go on the details of what happened that day, and why are we still talking about it after so many years? Why is it an important part of American history? So again, let's talk about what happened on that day. What did this event cause, and what are some of the effects on the world today of it? But that's going to be a later part. So let's talk about what happened on the exact day of it.
The exact day. Well, there was the brigade, 2506 Brigade, and they were a collection of like 100 or 1,400 people, or 1,400 people, or 1,500 people, and they sent out these troops to the west side of the swampy, remote area of Cuba, and they were going to advance into a place called I can't remember the name, Matiza, something like that. I can't remember. I can't recall the name. And they set up a defense there. That was their whole plan, to set up a defense on the other side. They advanced across the island. Then there was also earlier, prior to that, they invaded at night.
I mean, just to give to the geographical aspect of the event. So as you see, Cuba on the south, it was where the Bay of Pigs was.
Right.
There was the swampy area that you described. That was
Right.
in the southern part of the islands. And as Dr. Zaboni explained, they were the people that fled the island because of Castro, and they went to Florida, and then they were trained. If I'm correct,
They were
and then
trained in Guatemala.
That's
yeah.
right.
yeah, and then they were sent down as that special force.
Wasn't a huge problem to invade
there?
through the swampy area of it, because that caused some problems later on down the line of the Bay of Pigs. It caused more problems than
I mean, of course, it wasn't a good area. It was pretty
If you
nasty
want to
from what I know.
invade, you want to make sure you have stable ground you can move quickly across. A marsh is not the best advice for that.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Zaboni, tell us a little bit more about some details about the day, what happened on that specific event.
What happened on the specific event?
On the Day of Pigs,
On the
that
day-
we
yeah.
know, yeah.
Well, I mean, essentially what happened is that there were 1,400 something, or I forget the exact number of these people who went in. They actually went in. They had themselves. I mean, they had the training by the CIA, and yeah, Guatemala is where they did that. Because, by the way, going back to that for a minute, after that event in Guatemala happened, the United States ended up having restored to power there another one person friendly to its interests, and so that was a good place to train these people. So the CIA trains them, and they actually go in. They were provided with aircraft that were painted to look like Cuban aircraft.
Yeah.
And they flew in there. But anyway, but once they got there, yeah, the terrain was pretty bad. That was to their disadvantage. They also, the Cubans, Castro's military also knew they were coming. There were radio transmissions picked up. They also, they knew they were coming, this sort of thing, and so they were ready. And plus, that, they're very well trained and equipped and such. And they ended up getting pinned down on the beach. Many of them were killed. Others were captured.
And they outnumbered them, of course.
And they were out. Right, that's right. Castro's military outnumbered them too, and that was the end of it. Lots of them were killed. Others were captured. And the following year, the ones who were captured were, they were initially tried and sentenced to prison terms of decades.
Mm-hmm.
And this is in '61, of course. When this occurs. And in '62, they were ransomed. It was made known that these people are sentenced to prison terms, but they'll be released if you pay us this ransom in the form of food and medicine, tens of millions of dollars worth of food and medicine, because they kind of needed that there. And at one point during the course of all of that, Castro began to want to add another stipulation. Well, tens of millions of dollars in food and medicine, plus a couple of million in cash too. That ended up not happening, and so the people were released in a series of flights from Havana to Miami over the course of a couple of days. They returned in '62.
Yeah. So, a very bad day from what I know, from what I just heard for the American side.
Exactly. And what's interesting, there's all kinds of things that ramifications from this, but some of the immediate ones are that are interesting. Kind of a contrast is that some of Kennedy's people and Kennedy himself, as I said before, were thinking this is not a good idea for a variety of reasons. And some of Kennedy's people were trying to say, look, it's not a good idea for a lot of reasons, one of which is Castro was not a threat to us. So in other words, he's not a threat, militarily. You see, this is the whole thing about communism. The idea was, the whole line was, well, this guy's a communist, so he's a threat to us ipso facto. What it really was the economic interests that were messed up by Castro, okay? He's not really a threat. But Kennedy followed through with it because of the political pressure and so forth. But once this occurs, though, the interesting thing is that after this occurs, Castro and people in Cuba feel that the United States is a threat to them. Because, look, they just tried to invade and overthrow me, right?
Yeah.
And so, of course, this leads directly, really facilitated the Soviets' introduction of offensive missiles in Cuba.
Yeah. The alliance, yeah.
Right, yeah, exactly, because they already had the relations. Ours were severed, had been already with Cuba. The Soviets have diplomatic relations with Cuba in, well, at least in the early 60s, well, maybe it was 60, I forget, because Castro comes in 59 after his revolution overthrows Batista. And so the Soviets begin to introduce these missiles here, and Castro was only too happy to have them because, well, this will deter the Americans from trying to come in here and overthrow me and invade again. Of course, I don't know if he was thinking that having those missiles there, the Americans might go down and take him out, and that'd be the end of him too. But in any event, he thought of it as a defensive. As a defensive move against the Americans, whom he perceived were a threat to him.
Well, it's like today, like in today's politics and world, when you see, like, if I have the nukes, I'm safe from everybody.
Right,
So that was kind of
right.
his thought process.
Because if I use them, we all use them, then we're all dead.
Yeah, so I think it kind of worked, as you have Cuba as a Trojan horse close to America from the Soviet side, because it's how many miles is from Florida? It's really close.
90.
That's
About.
Yeah, it's super
exactly.
close.
Kind of messed up mutually assured destruction because they're so close. Mutual destruction relies on time to react. If they are 90 miles away, there is no time to react when those things launch.
No, absolutely.
Well, Castro was like, "Hey, this protects us from the Americans," and Soviets are like, "Well, we have missiles close enough to the United States where we can just bomb them in an instant." So it was just a win-win for both of them.
Well, we had missiles in Turkey.
Yeah, I
We had
mean,
missiles in Turkey, so it's a long logic. Hey, look, you have them right next to us, we have them right next to you. What's he gonna do?
and that was, I mean, that's how countries operated back then. Especially, you see, as you mentioned, Turkey and Russia. You have in the later years North Korea. You have all that development of that kind of, theory that if I have the nukes, I'll be safe. And that, I mean, Don Grisaboni, you study this. I mean, what Americans were probably more than terrified when they found out the news that their nukes were so close to them.
Oh yeah, terrified would be to put it lightly. What happened was that they were discovered there by what were just routine spy flights over Cuba. Taking pictures, and of course, the film is sent back, and these huge canisters of film is sent back, analyzed, and then they're looking, and they can see these sites where the Soviets are putting together these missile sites and getting to be able to launch missiles, and these things are identified as such. And of course it was kept hush hush for a while in the administration because what do that's going to create a panic and this sort of thing until they're ready to do it in a certain way, let everyone know. And what ended up happening was that Kennedy got on TV, or there was an announcement earlier on indicating that he was going to be getting airtime on the networks to speak about a matter of the highest national urgency, or something to that effect. And that's when he comes on and says and tells people in the United States that these things are here. And he says, and he basically indicates that they need to be removed now. And he also indicates that any attack on the United States or at any other country in the Western Hemisphere will be regarded as a direct attack of the Soviet Union upon the United States, which will require a response. And that's where he leaves it at that point. So people, and getting back to people here being terrified, what happened was once they hear this, the Soviet missiles are there, and we want them out. And well, how are they going to be taken out? Who's going to make them? Are they going to take them out? Yes or no? And people at the time were just convinced to get to the point that they were going to die. That this was, colleges, universities all over the country, right? People are attending from wherever they are, wherever they're from. And what people did, students at colleges and universities all over the United States, they packed their bags and went home. Because they figured, I'm going to die, and if I'm going to die, I'm going to go home and die with my family. Because they were just convinced of it. Because they're right there.
Didn't that give rise to the idea of a bunker, like a nuclear bunker, and like
fallout shelters.
Going underneath the tables, hope that the nuclear blast doesn't get you, which it probably would. But I don't know.
I mean,
it did. I mean, there had been a little bit of that in the 50s. But in the 60s, in fact, also under Kennedy, Kennedy actually began a nationwide fallout shelter program. In other words, which would provide for, and this was funded by the federal government, food and water supplies, which would be put into public buildings all over the country, which would be designated as public fallout shelters. And it was basically any building that went down deep underground.
So that was under Kennedy.
Right, that was under Kennedy, and some I think it was Emerson Hall, was it on this campus? I'm trying to remember. They have you seen one of these metal placards that say fallout shelter? It used to be on the side of the building over there.
No, I don't think so. No,
it's metal.
Wow.
And it's probably worn out now, but you can see the yellow parts of it. It was originally black and yellow, and it was reflective. I believe it was Emerson. Northeastern Hotel was one. Ford Field Post Office another. They have these placards on. It says fallout shelter on them. Mm-hmm. And these places were designated as places where if the big one comes in, going back to the idea that you don't have time to react too much time, if you're out and about somewhere, you can just run into one of these places. Yeah. And there's food and water for 2 weeks. You sit down for 2 weeks and then come out.
Even and especially Presque Isle, because I think Presque Isle here where we are, was one of the main military bases and targets, of course.
Right, and missiles were here for a short time, not for too long.
At the airport.
It was regarded as a target by people who lived here. They just, as far as they were concerned, there's no question this is a target.
Well, Kennedy came up here and talked because this was one of the major military
bases at the time.
Yeah.
She was here. Yeah, we do have that record that
that's
she
right.
gave a speech here, but
it was during World War II, and then during the Cold War that just continued because of the geographic proximity to Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can bet, Florida, imagine the bases there and the proximity. Imagine how people felt there and through the whole Gulf, of course, the Gulf of Mexico.
The entire state was just a blaring sirens and red warning signs.
The entire country.
Yeah.
So
schools would have nuclear nuclear drills. Tests, just like we would have a active school shooting test. We would.
Well, coming from someone who grew up in Florida, definitely they always have. Growing up, you always have hurricane preparation things that you go through, and obviously active shooter ones in school. But on top of all of that, they had to, train to get under their desk for nuclear war.
It was the norm of their day.
Yeah.
It was a regular routine to
it was
be
everywhere.
afraid.
Everywhere, and people debated it too. You would see this debated in popular magazines and so on. Some people, some things in magazines, some articles, and people would say in magazines and so on that, you must build shelters. This is important because it was put on individuals. That's the other thing. You have these public shelters in the form of designated public buildings, but then there was all kinds of pressure on ordinary families that you must build a shelter at your house to protect your family, and here's the information to do it. Here's the different kind of shelters you can build. Here are the materials, what the cost would be, all of that. But the responsibility for doing so was put on American homeowners, and so in that sense, what you have during the Cold War connected to the shelter program is a militarization of life among ordinary people in the United States. In other words, there's you have a blurring and a vanishing of any line between military and civilian in a sense. Because you're on the front lines now, you and your family, and you've got to protect them and be ready for any eventuality.
Yeah, and I mean, you even see the manuals of how to build, and it was so interesting, like
That's right.
the way they promoted it and the companies that sold all these things. It was
And
No.
some people here and there said this is nuts, but other people, did not. There was and so there's a question as to average ordinary people, did they really think that a shelter was going to work?
fair point. I mean, yeah.
Now, are these public fallout shelters? Are they still? Are they still well, not active, but like, are they still?
In effect.
Could you actually go in there in case of a nuclear attack now?
Well, I suppose who's going to stop you, but
Some of them.
but I mean,
And honestly-
officially no. This stopped. I used to remember the time period, but there was a certain time period during which the government ceased replenishing supplies, because the supplies would be these big tins of crackers, barrels of water, basic medical supplies, stuff like that. But at a certain point, they stopped doing that.
Were there cases of people robbing these fallout shelters to if they didn't have enough money to get
Their
food,
own
water?
supplies?
Yeah,
I mean,
would they rob these fallout shelters to provide for them? I imagine
don't
that
know.
would happen
During the panic,
I guess it
I
could.
imagine having to have a
Probably, yeah.
like for their own fallout shelters.
Yeah.
It was mostly military, so I don't think somebody will rob the military.
That's a good point.
And plus, they're also in public buildings. I mean, to go to
Yeah.
the post office and steal something is.
Just
But
sell my me with my barrel of water.
what was some of them the interesting, if that's the word I want, conflicts concerning these shelters is really one of the debates among people was, is this really going to save me or not? One of the other things that people actually talked about this, going back to the idea of, let's say a person had one in their home. They went out, got the materials and all of that, and they constructed one in their home. Okay? And some people did this. And one of the debates was, if you have a fallout shelter in your home and you are the only one in the area who has one, all your neighbors did not build one, do you have the moral right, if something happens, do you have the moral right to stand there with a gun and shoot your neighbors to stop them from coming into your fallout shelter and eat the food and drink the water that is meant for the survival of your family? Do you have the moral right to do so? And religious leaders and so on, they actually talked about this, which only gave more sort of fuel to the people who were saying this is all crazy, because they said, look at what we're doing, look at what we're talking about. We're
Yeah.
talking about whether it's moral to shoot someone to keep them out of my fallout shelter. Can you believe this?
The fact that you're having the debate
Right,
justifies discussing about it.
right, exactly.
I definitely had a point earlier, in comparison to New England. Normally people have cellars or basements. In Florida, a lot of people, they don't have that. When I lived in Florida, I didn't grow up with a cellar, So it's just kind of it was based on if you had enough money to get those supplies,
yeah.
build the thing, and then find a place to hunker down for it.
And the
Right.
thing, so I think the main point of this, because we kind of got away from the Bay of Pigs, the main point is that it did affect culture and
Yeah.
our society in a great
100%.
level. The Cold War and the Bay of Pigs and that big situation. So at this point, we would like to thank WUPI 92.1 FM for hosting our podcast, and we wanted to let you know that WUPI is now available on TuneIn. And we're highly encouraging you to go like their page on Facebook and Instagram and try not to miss an episode of our podcast. So, we talked a little bit about Cold War. We did talk about what happened at that situation. You having the missiles in Cuba, then you having that huge, that tremendous turbulent times in America, and the fear and how the events worked out with the Bay of Pigs. So I guess what I wanted to go on from that is why do we still care about it today? Like, why is it such a big, important event in our history in America? What's the spark that we consider this event a big event?
Framed even today, our relation with Russia isn't the best. Even though the countries and everything, their whole policies changed, the distrust is still there a little bit. Always has been. I think events like this kind of set off that distrust between the countries. I think that's really why it's important, because it still frames how we react with Russia, other communist countries today, even China.
And I mean, you did have, President Barack Obama. He signed he ended the embargo with Cuba a few years ago, and you kind of see that what was there before, it's not here anymore, because now you have trade again and you have that. But for a huge amount of time, you do have that hatred between the two nations and that militarization. And I think that goes back to communism and how we saw Cuba as a nation.
Well, I mean, to show the effects of communism in America, like McCarthy's trials, and just you're a communist, you're a communist, you're a communist, and it just the Red Scare, yeah. It just crazy.
So I guess I will consider that event a catalyst in shaping American opinion on communism and that competition with Russia.
The arms race. Who can get more world-ending things first?
Well, then that also led to competition, other things like the space race and the other races and
Races.
I mean, it was a crazy time.
Yeah.
So what happened after the Day of Pigs, Dr. Zaborny? What was what events happened after that was done?
Well, after the Bay of Pigs, of course, that really facilitated the Soviets putting the missiles in Cuba. And they were discovered, and going back to what we were saying before, that there was this panic in the United States. People thought they were going to die. They were convinced of it within a matter of hours or days, or once they became operational, which was probably going to be pretty soon. And one of the things that occurs is that once these things were discovered, that this was brought before the UN. And the photographs were put there to show everyone, here's these things, and they've got to be out of here, and so forth. And because the Soviets up to that point had been denying that they were there. But anyway, and so what happens with the Cuban Missile Crisis? What happens there is that people didn't realize it at the time. Only afterward, how close it came to war. They knew it was close, but we realized later it was even closer than we thought. What the United States does, Kennedy administration, this is where you get into words being significant. The United States establishes a quarantine of Cuba. In other words, putting naval vessels around Cuba to stop Soviet ships from coming in. And they call it a naval quarantine because it's really a blockade, but you're not going to call it a blockade because a blockade is an act of war, so we'll call it a quarantine. And so... And the big tension was, would the Soviets' ships stop? Would they try to run this quarantine? Ultimately, they did. They come right up to the line, then turn around, and then they agreed to dismantle the missiles in return for a U.S. pledge to never invade Cuba, and also in return for, you mentioned the missiles in Turkey a few months later. They were quietly removed a few months later. With a stipulation that no big fanfare was made about that part.
If I may ask, I know that we had some close calls akin to nuclear attacks. Were there any events that we were at the brink of the abyss?
Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well,
the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were. The Cuban Missile Crisis was arguably, I think, the biggest one. There were also There were also some events early in the 60s in Berlin. The Soviets had desired, well, first of all, the whole division of Germany thing, because there was no peace treaty, and then West and East Germany, and then within East Germany, Berlin divided into 4 zones. The Soviets had wanted the Americans and the British and French out, and they were doing all kinds of things to try to nudge them out. One of the things they did was they blockaded Berlin. They blockaded land access to Berlin, because Berlin's in East Germany. But part of the deal was, even though it's in East Germany, the Americans, the British, and French could still go there. But the Soviets decided to blockade Berlin to try to force them out. This sort of thing, and so and then of course the Berlin Wall going up in '61. And so there were instances concerning Germany, concerning Berlin, where U.S. and Soviet tanks in Berlin were just literally nose to nose.
Yeah.
So I mean, there were other things. I mean, that of course you're dealing with conventional weapons, but that of course at the time could lead to other things.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So again, to reconfigure again, to reestablish our thoughts. So the Bay of Pigs was the event that inflamed the American Cuban Missile Crisis, the tensions, I guess.
Right.
That was the spark.
Well, without the Bay of Pigs, JFK wouldn't have been so desperate to operate Operation Mongoose. And then, if the Bay of Pigs never happened, the Soviets, well, they probably would have set up missiles in Cuba anyways, but it probably quickened the pace to get them there.
Yeah.
And I think too, if you go back to the question you asked Evan of why is this why do we care about this, why is this important, I think a starting point for that is just even before the Bay of Pigs comes to mind, the question that you would ask yourself, which would ultimately lead to that and other things, is if you stop for a moment and think about this in recent years, this really tortured relationship the United States has with Cuba, and if you stop for a moment and say, well, why is that? Well, to find the answer, you've got to go back to Cuban history, which includes the Bay of Pigs, things before then, things after that, and also, of course, in totally other contexts, all of this about Guantanamo Bay and holding people there. Should that be done? Yes or no? Should Guantanamo Bay be closed? Yes or no? And then and even in there too, you think about Guantanamo Bay. That's in Cuba. Oh, wait a minute! I thought Castro ran Cuba. How do we have this place? Once again, the answer is in Cuban history, because the United States put it there when years before Castro ever showed up, and of course once he came to power in '59, he wasn't going to kick it out of there, and so you have this weird sort of thing down there. There's Castro's Cuba, and then there's this U.S. naval base on the eastern end of the island, and between the two of them, there's the largest minefield in the Western Hemisphere, right? And so, but there's all this weird stuff, and of course the embargo, which would come up in recent years. Sometimes people would say, oh, well, maybe we should lift this, maybe we should change the relationship. And then the Miami exile community, which has a lot of political influence, ooh, no, we can't. We have to, it's got to change. Cuba has to change. And so what you end up with is going back to the question, you go to the Bay of Pigs and to so many other things because you pause with what's going on now and think, why is that? How was that? And that's what leads you back to the Bay of Pigs and everything else that came before and after it. And of course, most recently, the U.S.-Cuban relationship is in a. It's not the same as it was years ago. There are some some travel restrictions have been lifted, that sort of thing. But it's not totally and the U.S. has relations with Cuba in 2015, I think that was, reestablished relations for the first time since 1960.
Yeah.
President Obama goes there in 2015. I'm sorry, 2016, the year after relations were reestablished in 2015. He meets with Raul Castro, who was Fidel's brother, and so you have this what's referred to as the Cuban thaw. There are some travel restrictions lifted. There's a little bit more allowed than there have been before, but it's still not wide open for the U.S. companies to do business there, though.
Yeah, that is true. And that might not happen for a while,
No.
because from
But I
how...
remember,
Maybe ever.
Yeah, I remember when they did lift it, and then there was like a lot of uproar because Beyonce went there, and everyone was like, "Why is Beyonce going?" She went before Obama even went there, or something like that, and people were really mad about it.
Yeah.
And then like the pictures that came out of Cuba, because they'd essentially been stuck in like the 1960s, and they had all these old cars, and it looked like really retro, and
I
they were
mean,
just stuck in
Yeah,
the
American
time.
cars, old American cars
Yeah.
from the 50s,
Yeah.
Chevys from the 50s, and they keep them running
They were,
because
and I mean, the
that's all
economic...
they had, yeah.
And the economic situation is another topic that if we touch
Yeah.
upon, it's going to
Oh,
take
boy.
us another day to talk about.
And the other interesting thing too is, well, I mean, the place was, well, there were for years lots of American cars from the 50s because, well, you know, we dominated the place. So of course,
Yeah.
I mean, at the time, most cars anywhere on the planet were made here. Not
Yeah.
anymore, but anyway. So including Cuba. But one of a couple of things, if you look at that time period and then more recently, is that the people have been trying to figure out how certain variables play into continued debate about the relationship. And one of the things is, you know, now, decades later, you know, you have a new generations of Cubans who were not there when Castro came in. And so to them, the question becomes, what does Castro's revolution mean to us? Not as much as it did to people who were there at the time,
Right.
that they loved him, you know, and so forth. And so the revolution was everything. But now there's different people there. So
Yeah, and how I see some events on that, because we were wrapping up, because we did talk about it with 48 minutes. I think that Cuba was that event was what Americans would like to see as they wanted to see that event like Panama, like what happened in Panama, that they did go over and they changed the whole political situation and they made their allies. I think that's what the goal was, kind of the idea, but it didn't work out that way.
right, no, it did not.
Yeah.
To say the least.
So any
Exact opposite.
Yeah.
exactly. So any closing remarks? From,
Well, I think that well, one could go off on all kinds of directions on this, but I think that it could fit within the question of why do we care about it. It could also fit in all kinds of other things. But I mean, it's an example of the larger pattern in the U.S. foreign policy prior to that and since then, which is a dogged determination to try to control world events, and an assumption that we can. Well, I mean, the question of whether we should is another question, but that aside for a moment, you know, can we? And this is, and I think this is an example of something that shows that, well, you know, we really can't. You know, we don't like this guy, but well, there's nothing we can do about it. You know, and I think one of the things that comes out of Vietnam was that too, that we cannot control world events. This is what we wanted in southern Vietnam, this kind of government, but it didn't work out that way. That was one of the lessons that comes out of Vietnam, and one of the disturbing things is that you look at events since then, Iraq, Afghanistan, and places like this, you see this assumption embedded there too, that we can just go over there and we're going to turn the Middle East into a democracy or something. Like Vietnam, like other places, an assumption that rests on nothing better than quicksand, because you like Vietnam, you know, you have this total ignorance of the history of these places that would tell you that this is just not feasible.
Well, that also leads to like America also painting Castro as like, oh, this dictator is going in and punishing his people, like Saddam Hussein and Fidel Castro and Ho Chi Minh and everything.
I mean,
So
that's the cool thing with history, that you can relate different events together and see that it kind of has like a same recipe.
Right. Yeah, I was trying to remember. I think I have to go back and look into this, but I think that Castro, immediately upon coming to power, I think he visited the United States, came to New York, met with some people. I think I'd have to look into that. But of course, you know, of course, at that time, well, he's a great guy, you know, charismatic and all of this, you know. But of course, that was before you started nationalizing Americans' property down there too.
Yeah, it's always
and then that great guy is no good anymore.
yeah.
it's always a threat when he threatens us.
And then he becomes a dictator.
Got them? Fine. Mess with our money. We're coming after you.
Yeah.
Fair point. Well, great discussion, and that's all for today's episode of the History Hour. Thanks for listening, and thank you to Dr. John Zerboni for joining us today, along with Chris, Bethany, and Caleb for sharing their ideas and knowledge about the topic of the Bay of Pigs. Join us again next week when we talk about the Aroostook War of 1838 to 1839. And make sure you tune in to WUPI 92.1 FM so you never miss an episode. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.